The Greeks, when they got hold of astrology, changed things from the Babylonians, they included things the Babylonians didn't. But importantly, they also started trying to think about it mechanically, like what are the actual mechanisms for how the planets affect us? They weren't doing it in the empirical way of saying, well, the last time Jupiter was in Sagittarius, then the king died. No, they actually do pretty much everything based on ultimately puns. There was one particular usurper by the name of Leontius. He tried having his coronation on just the right astrological time and date. His astrologer basically said, if you put the crown on at this time, great long reign, everything's going to be great. Look at these signs, it's beautiful. Does that, a couple years later, his head's removed from his body. Later, astrologer looks and is like, you doofuses, you forgot to account for Venus. So the idea that the laws of nature in completely predictable ways can create the object so magnanimously, so beautifully. And then once I found out, hey, there's other theories. Some people are saying it's a supernova. Some people are saying it was just a single planet. It was a comet. It was a special horoscope. It was something that no one could even see. It was an early discovery of Uranus. It was an alien spacecraft. Something weird is going on here. And that's when I started doing my deep dive that ultimately became at least one book project, which I have to plug.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and I'm joined by Adair. And today we're going to talk about the history of the Star of Bethlehem and all the fun stuff surrounding it. Welcome to Gnostic Informant, Adair.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure having you on, and this is a fascinating subject because there's some truth to this, if I'm not mistaken, that there was a star, or maybe different stars, or we gotta give credit where it's due, right?
There are things that are astronomically true that we can verify to levels of precision that the ancient world could never have thought of, but it's also built on a foundation of sand. And once we start digging, we can see that the beautiful artifices built on top of it kind of sink quickly. But there's a lot of great science, a great astronomy that we can consider, we can talk about. And, well, talking about science always makes me happy.
Me too. I love science. Science is fun. So now correct me where I'm wrong. I'm reading an article about Johannes Kepler, and he is saying that due to the motions of the stars and the planets, we can backtrack. We can look back to see where this position of the same planets and stars were 1,000 years ago, or even 2,000 years ago, because they're always doing the same thing every year. And he was saying that the Star of Bethlehem, it has some truth behind it. What does he mean by that?
All right. So let me give a little bit of background to Kepler himself, because I'm pretty sure this is not, unfortunately, a household name for your audience. We'll fix that today. We'll fix that. So Johannes Kepler was a German astronomer from about 400-ish years ago. He is important to the history of astronomy because he was an early convert to heliocentrism. He learned about the idea from one of his teachers, just completely fell in love with the idea, thinking that this is the way that God would definitely set up the universe, and basically devoted the rest of his life to trying to figure out a model to explain that system. And among his many other things was the question of, okay, if we also have better astronomy and better tools for predicting where the planets are, then yes, we could also backtrack and think about where things were. At that time, people were trying to figure out, okay, what can we figure about the history of the world now with like a better tool set for knowing where the planets were? Because like, hey, here's this ancient record from the Egyptians or the Babylonians or what have you. It describes this conjunction or this eclipse or things like that. If we now have the mathematical technology to predict it, maybe we can actually date these events. And of course, Kepler's also thinking within biblical chronology. When was the world created and things like that? So how can we apply these tools? So he does apply these tools to the story of Jesus, and he's actually one of the early figures to argue against what was the traditional date at that time, that Jesus was born on December 25th, 1 BC. and arguing that instead, based on mostly historical points, but also on his own astrological reasoning, he was actually born a few years earlier than that, in like 5-4 BC.
Right.
Ultimately, then like figure out, hey, this is when King Herod was supposed to have lived, and
Right.
that was the king that was supposed to have caused a lot of trouble for baby Jesus, as the story goes, at least.
Right.
So, so he's working on a astrological theory that predates him by several centuries, and that he's applying to Jesus. And the basic idea is this: that according to astrologers, there is this particular combination of planets of Jupiter and Saturn in what is called a conjunction. So there's the popular way of saying that's when the two planets are close together. More accurately, it's supposed to be when they have the same line of longitude in the sky. Basically, if you drew a line from the North Pole to the South Pole and the celestial sphere, that line of longitude would go through Jupiter and Saturn. That's a conjunction.
Wow.
They could be close, they could be far away. It depends on the situation. But for an astrologer, all they care about, are they on that magical line?
Right.
And according to the astrologers, that this conjunction happens approximately every 20 years, and they're supposed to be really important. And they become even more important once they've entered particular signs of the zodiac, when they've actually changed the element of signs. Because there's this interesting thing that when they're conjunctioning, they'll conjunction into different signs each time, but for a while they'll keep being in the same triangle of signs where they're the same element. And so they're like, ooh, this is cool. This looks, magical and mysterious. But it's a triangle that's ever so slowly shifting. So eventually it goes into a new element. And then they say this is an even greater kind of conjunction. And when you have the first conjunction in the fiery sign, that's the top dog. That's the best conjunction you could ever have. This is supposed to be the sort of stuff that happened like before the Great Flood or the birth of Muhammad or things like that.
Right.
I think Kepler also tries associating it with the birth of Charlemagne. I forget the details off the top of my head, but he's basically saying like, this is a theory of astrological history. And so he's like, yeah, this better apply to Jesus.
Of course.
And so he tries arguing, so there's these, not just one, but actually 3 conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn in Pisces in the year 7 BCE. And he's like, okay, this must have been the sign that the Magi, the wise men from the Matthean story of Jesus' birth, that must have been what got them all excited. Now, a few problems with that. Okay. One is Pisces isn't going to be the sign you look to for the greatest possible conjunctions. I don't know how familiar you are with the zodiac. Do you know what Pisces is supposed to be? Like what figure in the sky?
So Pisces, if I'm not mistaken, is the fishes that go in separate directions.
Yeah. And they're often depicted like tied with ribbon, or they're somehow, tied up together.
Yeah.
And so you think fish, do you think of something related to fire? Probably not.
Not really, yeah.
Exactly. So in astrology, they're considered a watery sign. So these conjunctions in a watery sign shouldn't be the greatest possible. So Kepler first has to fudge and say, well, they were close to the border between Pisces and Aries. Aries is a fire sign. So, that's close enough.
Wow. Now, let me ask you this. So I've seen this model before where you got the zodiac where there's 12 signs divided up into 4, but there's also the earth, air, water, and fire. Is that what it is?
Yeah, the 4 elements. Yes.
So that's how they divide up these 12 constellations into 4 groups. Is that what it is?
That's one of the ways. There's the 4 elements, and so each 3 constellations are assigned together with one element. And if you were to draw them as a circle, there would be an equilateral triangle that would take you between those 3 elements. And that would be true for each of the 4 elements.
So this is how they categorize things. And then you got the planets. So each planet has a sign, or is it each sign has a planet assigned to it? Because there's 7 planets, right? I mean, technically it's 5 plus the sun and the moon. So is it like there's 12, which categorize into 7 planets, which categorize into 4 elements? Is that how it goes?
There's a whole lot of ways you can combine these things together, and which is also one of the problems with astrology, because if you're looking at a horoscope, what does it mean? Give me 5 minutes, I'll tell you what it means, and it's whatever you want it to mean. Just give me 5 minutes and I'll find a way. Right. So like, for example, the signs, there's masculine and feminine. The planets can have strength or weakness depending on if they're rising signs versus setting signs. There's usually special places within the signs themselves. On top of that, you can also have not just the signs, but what are also called the houses, which don't correspond to the actual signs in the sky, but just the angles relative to the horizon. You have the various lots, like the lot of fortune and many things. So basically, if you go deep enough, you can make a horoscope so convoluted with so many different lines going everywhere. You'll basically need a PhD just to even figure out what's going on. And this is, one of the reasons why astrology usually isn't considered too scientific. It's so wonderfully convoluted, and there's no actual way to say what things are better or worse, what's stronger or weaker in a sign. So you basically get whatever you want, and there's a lot of historical precedent for that. For example, I'll give you an historical example. In the early Byzantine era, you have emperors for a while basically coming and going. Like the same emperor will, rise to power, and then he has to run for his life. Then he'll, get an army, like pay enough people, and come running back and punish who usurped him. So there was one particular usurper by the name of Leontius, and he tried having his coronation on just the right astrological time and date. His astrologer basically said, if you put the crown on at this time, great long reign, everything's going to be great. Look at these signs. It's beautiful. Come on, best ever. Does that. A couple years later, his head's removed from his body.
Wow.
Later, astrologer looks and is like, you doofuses, you forgot to account for Venus. Come on.
Of course there's a reason. It has to be.
Exactly, yeah. So you realize that you're going to get the result that you expect, the result that you want, or you'll even just find all sorts of other convoluted things the astrologers have come up with. So, like even one of the greatest of the ancient astronomers, Claudius Ptolemy in the 2nd century, he's basically, not only describing the entire system he has, but he's also trying to defend it, and in particular defend it from the people saying, you guys are a bunch of hucksters and shysters. And he basically has to argue that, one, yes, there's lots of shysters out there, but I'm not one of them. And two, also, this practice is like really hard. It is the hardest science, so we're going to make mistakes.
Right. And
which is a big excuse.
Yeah, of course. And it makes me think of, I don't know, are you familiar with the Greek Alexander romance?
Yes.
So do you remember the part where Alexander's being born and the Nectanebo's giving all these horoscopes and he's saying all this weird random language, and he's talking about, if you're born now, you're going to be a laughing stock, or if you're born and now it's Jupiter and it's in the sign of whatever, and give birth
exactly
now.
Yeah, he's going through the various rising signs and telling Alexander's mother Olympias to hold on, don't let get him outlet. So clearly this author knows nothing about giving birth, because you can't command a woman to give birth in a given hour. It's like, no, that is not how this works. When this baby comes, it comes, okay?
Right.
So yeah, he's like saying, no, wait, when we have this rising sign with this planet here, this isn't very good, so wait another hour, wait a couple hours, and now go sit in the chair and push him out.
Right. It's fascinating.
So that is and interesting enough, you can actually look at the details, and you can actually date the birth of Alexander from that romance.
Really?
But he's off by about a year. It looks like somebody was trying, but they were off a little bit on when Alexander was born. And that might also be because the Macedonian calendar is really convoluted to understand and pick up a text and read. But it looks like somebody was trying. They got it in the right neighborhood of when he was born. So It wasn't just a random collection. Somebody was doing the math, more or less.
Yeah, I always wondered that. I always wondered if they were actually putting effort into that, and that, like you said, they were, because I know that was written a lot later. It wasn't written right after life. It was written centuries later. But that's pretty interesting that you just said that they were pretty close. And but it shows you what people were thinking in those times. That was like a science, which now is not a science, but that was considered to be a science to those people.
Honestly, in many ways, I in some ways like to distinguish between the older forms of astrology that the Babylonians were doing, and then once the Greeks got a hold of it, because the Greeks, when they got hold of astrology and were adding to the system, they changed things from the Babylonians. They included things the Babylonians didn't. But importantly, they also started trying to think about it mechanically, like what are the actual mechanisms for how the planets affect us, and also trying to gather data. So, for example, also in the 2nd century, a little bit later than the time of Ptolemy, there's another guy by the name of Vettius Valens. And he is not just also saying here's all the various associations you need to have memorized to give a horoscope, but he also says he has all these case histories, dozens and dozens. So it's clearly somebody is going out trying to collect data to make their assessments. So it's data gathering, trying to come up with some sort of theory making. It looks much more scientific than the older Babylonian system, where it's not clear how they actually made their predictions, but if it's like what we can determine, they weren't doing it in the empirical way of saying, well, the last time Jupiter was in Sagittarius, then the king died. No, they actually do pretty much everything based on ultimately puns. They really see the world that ultimately was like controlled by, what we now like label sympathetic magic. This is like this sounds like this word is similar to this word, and with that sort of wordplay, this is what is going to happen. So it's not even observe this, saw what happened, and then predict it again. It's, oh, this is the wordplay that goes on when we're, doing these sorts of things. And we can tell that actually because the Babylonians, the Assyrians, they give predictions of what will happen for things that can't astronomically happen. They clearly never observed it. So, for example, there's a prediction for what your horoscope or what your what you should be divining based on if you see the sun at midnight. Basic astronomy tells you that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
So exactly, it's like, so clearly they didn't observe it. If they observed it, they would have said, oh shit, it's the end of the world.
Yeah.
But instead, they just basically said, when you see this, it means that the crop might have a little bit of roughness or something like that. It's like, it does not lead to the magnitude of what you'd expect to see this. So clearly, they're going on a system that is not based on observation of cause and effect, but what they ultimately, how they thought the world worked. The gods work in this world ultimately through the power of metaphor.
Now, does that give a lot of room for political play? Like say, for example, the Egyptian pharaoh has all these astrologers around him, and he wants to hear good news, right? Now these astrologers are going to come around and be soothsayers and say what he wants to hear. Do you think there's a lot of that going on too?
Oh, almost certainly, just because like the way the Romans would do it, sometimes there might be arguments between the council and the various other members of the Senate, and they can, get one of the augurs to say, oh, the signs are bad. We can't have a meeting today. Got to delay it.
Right.
It's like, oh, the birds flew the wrong direction. It's another bad sign. We got to wait. It's people have been, using these sorts of things to these ends for who knows how many centuries. But also, sometimes they're also trying to look ahead to problems and try to solve problems that don't exist. So we actually have letters between scholars in the Assyrian court saying, hey, we know that there's going to be an upcoming occultation between the moon and Jupiter. That is, the moon's going to come and it's going to cover up Jupiter. And according to their astrology books, this means the king's going to die. What are we going to do about this? And they have a plan for that. What they do for when these signs are coming, when they know these bad signs are coming, they tell the king, temporarily leave the throne. We're going to put this person, this, commoner, to sit on the throne. So if anything bad happens, it's going to happen to the person on the throne.
Interesting.
And just to make sure it's over, once the bad sign is gone, we'll take care of the commoner, just to make sure 100% that the bad news only happened to him and the king is safe.
Wow, it's fascinating. And it's like, and then you start to think about like these astrologers are probably some of the smarter people in the kingdom or whatever, and so they're probably making decisions on behalf of the kingdom or the empire. And sometimes if they have to do a little bit of manipulating, let's say the king, let's say you got a king like Nero or something who's just kind of crazy and he's just reckless. Well, I guess the best way to get into that king's head would be, hey, Nero, by the way, there's a sign that says we shouldn't do this because the gods are telling us not to do it. Otherwise, if you just tell them straight up, hey, I think this is a bad idea. Who are you? I'm Nero. I'm not going to listen to you. So it almost sounds like it could be used sort of in a good way. I guess I don't know if that makes it good, but like in a political way, I guess.
Yeah. It could definitely be used to political advantage, or you can always try to find a way to dismiss it. I'll give you two examples from the Roman emperors just to come to mind. First off, with Vespasian. I really wish I could have met him because I think we would have hit it off well because we both like puns a lot, too much. And I'll give you an example of a pun related to this because towards the end of his life and toward the end of his reign, there was a comet seen in the sky. And everyone's like, we all know comets are bad news. This is the sign that Vespasian is in trouble, that he's going to die. Vespasian looks at that and says, guys, don't worry, this sign isn't about me. First off, just to know the background, comet, it comes from the Latin word that means hair and head.
Oh,
And Vespasian is like, don't worry, comets, they're not about me. It's about the Persian emperor because he's hairy and I'm bald.
really? So he's being smart about it, and he's trying to
Yes.
like deflecting it off. Like that's interesting.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the prophecy came true and he died within a couple months of that.
Wow. So there is
According
there
to
is
a few
that.
different records, his last words were, "Oh no, I'm becoming a god."
I remember reading that, and I think it was Suetonius or one of those writers that said that was his last. He literally just stood up and said, "I'm becoming a god," which is really strange last words for anybody.
Pretty much, I think he knew that he was going to be immortalized, just like the other cults of the emperors. So he's like, this is just his way of saying, "Bye, everybody. I hope I have a nice cult."
Yeah, because he was deified, and then
Yeah.
son Titus, when he died, he said, "I made one mistake," and then he just died. That was the last thing he said. No one got to hear what his mistake was. But
I forgot to turn the oven off.
yeah, that could be fun. So
Oh, and
we
the other
two examples.
example,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, the other example I was thinking of also with a comet with um, Caesar Augustus. So basically, just after the death of Julius Caesar and the reading of the will, and Octavian finding out, oh, I'm now the adopted son of Julius Caesar. I'm now rich, politically connected. Oh, and there's probably all sorts of knives right behind my back now. I better be careful. Uh, and around the time that they were celebrating Caesar and having these games for him, there was a new light seen in the sky. And depending on whose side you were on, either this was a comet and a terrible sign, or this was the soul of Julius Caesar rising up into heaven.
Right.
Now, which side are you on depends on were you pro Caesar or anti Caesar? Were you with the assassins or were you with the new factions that were pro Caesar?
Good point.
And we see some interesting attempts to explain it in both directions. There was apparently one Etruscan prophet who saw this comet, said, "This is like the end of the age and the coming of a new age is going to be bad," and he committed suicide right on stage, right in the middle of the forum. He's
Oh,
like, "Guys, it's that bad. I'm done."
wow. People really believed it, huh?
Apparently,
But you know
that's
what's
some
funny?
dramatic effect, you have to say.
And I was gonna say,
Now,
it's funny because he wasn't not saying that the prophecy was true, but about a new age coming, he wasn't wrong. The new age definitely came.
yeah, well, the thing is actually how they found a way to twist that because basically you got to get, you got one prophet saying one thing. What's the best way to reinterpret a prophecy? Get a new prophet to tell you what was really meant.
Right.
And apparently they got news from one of the sibling oracles, the one
Yeah.
down in the region of Naples. And according to her, and when I say according to her, well, does anyone actually ever see this Sybil? No. In fact, at this time, because she's immortal, but she shrinks with time, she probably fits inside of a glass jar. This is someone you don't go and visit in a temple. No. But according to her, she said, and we totally know she said this, the new age is the beginning of the golden age.
Wow.
So actually, this is a great thing, and this is actually then
For
what
Augustus.
Virgil starts promoting in around 40 BC, just a few years later, and then
Right.
eventually Julius or Caesar Augustus himself says, "Yeah, it was a comet, but it was the best possible comet. It was my
Right.
comet."
And I was just gonna say, because Ovid's Metamorphosis and the final book, I think it's book 12, I'm not sure, but it's the last book of Ovid's Metamorphosis. It's called the Apotheosis of Julius Caesar, where he mentions that comet. He says the comet, and then Julius Caesar took his spot on the throne of Venus. So the comet is Venus now. I don't know if it really was Venus or is it just another comet. I don't know if you know anything about that, but that's what.
Yeah, the imagery is a little bit confusing because sometimes it's they call the new star like Caesar's Venus or something like that. Though I think the way Ovid in particular talks about it is Venus, the goddess, comes down and lifts up Caesar's soul and is like carrying his soul up to heaven. And eventually, while going up, his soul becomes basically so hot from the process of moving up that it just becomes incandescent and she lets it go. And that soul rising is the comet that was seen after his death.
And people actually thought this was happening.
Well, they saw it in the sky.
Yeah, there was a comet there, so that's fascinating that people actually. And then so now you got a couple years later. Now Augustus he does his battles with Mark Antony and Lepidus, and they fight it out, and then he becomes basically the sole emperor of the Roman Empire, and these coins are being in transaction, and they have on the back the coin of Venus, or the symbol of Venus, with the words Divius Ilius, son of God, for Augustus. So that tells you right there, this was a big deal in that time period of Julius.
And they're referencing the particular comet because on those coins as well, you can actually see one of the lines of that star is actually a bit fuzzy. It's trying to look like a comet's tail.
Yeah. And some of them have like an X. Some of them have an X with an extra line, and there's like different types of. I mean, they're printing them differently. It seemed like.
Oh yeah. It's one of the very, very rare cases where somebody interpreted a comet as a positive sign, but it took a lot of twisting, and it was clearly politically motivated. Right. Because there's definitely no way someone's going to say, "Yeah, that terrible sign, that's for me." No. You're gonna find whatever you can. You're gonna make up prophecies. You're gonna hire your best poet to do whatever it takes to make you look good.
And that's basically what astrology is, though. If you think about it, no one wants to hear bad news. Everyone wants the good news.
Exactly. Yeah. If you pull up a newspaper and you look up your sun sign, it's just going to tell you, extremely generic advice, things that, should make you feel good. And also, if you looked at the wrong sun sign, it doesn't matter because they're all going to say things that apply to anyone with a pulse.
Yeah, they all are so generic that it can apply to anybody. It's like, well, you saw your friend today. I did see my friend today. That's awesome. It's like, whatever. But I want to jump back to this 4 BC or 7 BC, I think it was, this conjunction. Now, do we actually have confirmation that there actually was this happening in 7 BC?
Well, so first off, like when it comes to just straight up, we can plug it into our computers, run the clock back, and see very clearly that there was these conjunctions, and we can see, because also it was a question for a long time, how close were these conjunctions? Like, if you were looking at them in the sky, how close would they have appeared? Would they have been very far apart? Would they have been right on top of each other? Because some people want to propose, if the conjunction was a really close one, then maybe they would have looked like a single star, and that would then conform to the story because it only talks about his star singular, not plural.
Right.
But we do the math, we churn it back, and we find the closest these planets got back then for this conjunction was about a degree. Now, does a degree sound large? For comparison, the full moon is half a degree wide. So we're talking 2 full moon diameters of separation. In other words, only if you've removed your eyes would you actually think it's one object. It would have clearly not have looked like one object. It would have obviously been 2.
Right.
Conversely, though, if you remember the news from last year, from last December, when people were saying the Christmas star was reappearing, that was a super close conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn. And that one was that one was, they were almost on top of each other. It was not quite close enough that you would say they became one object, but it sure was a spectacular view if you could see it. And the keyword is if.
Was it on December 22nd or something like that, or 23rd, or was it actually on Christmas?
It wasn't like the closest approach wasn't on Christmas itself, but it was in the neighborhood. It was right around the 21st, 22nd.
Yeah.
And the only thing that prevented me from seeing it is the fact that I'm in Massachusetts, so I get Massachusetts weather.
Yeah, I was in New York and I couldn't see it either. And but I do remember hearing about it and reading about it, and I was like, oh, that's pretty interesting. And it's just really, it's fascinating because, but see, now you're saying that it would have looked like 2 stars, because I was like, sort of like hope. It's weird that I like want it to be true because it's so it like makes the whole thing more plausible, like with the Magi looking up and seeing this big giant, because if the 2 stars are close together, wouldn't it be a lot brighter too?
So they would have looked like a very bright object together, that their brightnesses would have roughly added together and become much brighter than either one on its own. And when it comes to wanting it, a little bit back in the first time I came across these sorts of astronomical or astrological explanations for the Star of Bethlehem, I was just starting in college, and I was working at the planetarium at my college at Michigan State University. And I actually got to run the show. I became a show presenter. They let me play with all the machinery and present stuff.
That's awesome.
And so the first time I'm watching this Christmas show, and it explains that this is also a time when I'm still, I describe myself as a Catholic deist at that time.
Yeah.
So the idea that the laws of nature in completely predictable ways can create the object so magnanimously, so beautifully, and so well that we can know because we know the laws of nature, that just seemed like, no, that's exactly what a god would do.
Yeah.
Problem was, the thing they showed in that planetarium show, I found it wasn't the only conjunction hypothesis out there. The
Wow.
one that they talked about was a close conjunction between Jupiter and Venus in 2 BC, which
Oh,
also is after the death of King Herod. So the show also has to argue that Herod was dead later than what other historians will say. And then once I found out, hey, there's other theories. Some people are saying it's a supernova. Some people are saying it was just a single planet. It was a comet. It was a special horoscope. It was something that no one could even see. It was an early discovery of Uranus. It was an alien spacecraft.
wow.
I then realized, okay, something weird is going on here. And that's when I started doing my deep dive that ultimately became at least one book project, which I have to plug.
Yeah, of course. And everybody, there's a link in the description. Check that out. And definitely check that out. And so that just opens up a whole nother bunch of questions now, because now it's like you have all these different theories on what actually happened. Supernova, was there a supernova around that time? Is that even a thing? Or
So the way to know that for sure, because those are the sorts of things we can't predict.
right?
We can't predict it based on like planetary models. And in our galaxy, that will be a supernova every several decades, roughly, very roughly.
Yeah.
So if there was one, basically the only way we'll know is if there's a record. Fortunately, we actually have particularly good records, not from the Babylonians or the Greeks. Actually, some of our best records come from China.
Wow.
In particular, they had pretty good records, or at least okay records for comets. They recorded mostly the comets that were on the brighter side, so not like the super dim ones that you'd have to really squint really hard to even notice. And also, it probably had to correspond with something politically important, so it'd be mentioned in their historical records. Because they weren't necessarily like keeping super accurate records that are going to record the sky every night. We're going to record the stuff that seems related to what's going on in the actual royal court and explain what's going on there in part of that narrative. But nonetheless, in 5 BC, we do have a record of a comet. And in 4 BC, some people have argued that Chinese record is also either of a comet or of a supernova. Depends on which author you're looking at. They'll argue back and forth what it ought to be. But either way, we know there were comet-like objects, at least in 5 and in 4 BC. Then the question is, okay, is this what is being described in the gospel story? I argue, hell no, if you can read the book. If you could read the actual original Greek in it, because once you do, you realize this is supposed to be a magic star. This is not something that somebody calculates out.
That's a good
like
point.
The author is going out of his way to say, this ain't the regular stuff.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then I want to know. I wonder if you know about this. There was a king named Mithridates VI.
Yes.
Jupiter, I think it's
Mhm.
he had a story.
The good father.
Yes, and I think he's called the Poison King too. I think.
Mhm.
Now he had a story written about him that I think is lost, but I guess a little fragments survive, or commentaries maybe survive. I'm not really sure. Maybe you know about this, but it's supposedly that his star was also signified by Magi looking up at a star in the east. Now I don't know if this is maybe a precursor, some sort. Like, not, I'm not saying they stole this story, but maybe it was like it's like a genre, maybe like some sort of
Mhm.
like a style of writing.
So it's an interesting complication of things because the alleged comets that were supposed to be at both the birth and coronation of Mithridates was for a while thought to be mythical, just added flourish to his story. And most of that story we get actually from a Roman source who's uh, quoting either a another source that was in the court of Mithridates or other people that remembered the stories of him. It's a little bit unclear that chain of custody, but nonetheless, we have it in Roman Latin sources, and also it looks like some of those story details get told later in Zoroastrian prophecies. Because I look at the details and I realize, oh, they're telling the story of Mithridates here, in particular about how when he was a kid he basically had to run off and live in the wilderness while his mother ruled things. things that were unusual for his biography, but are quite interesting. And again, once we go back to the Chinese annals, we discover, oh yeah, there actually was a comet at his year of birth, at his coronation year, as best as we can reconstruct.
Wow.
So it looks like those comets indeed were real and was part of his propaganda, because he also seemed to include it on some of his coinage as well.
Yeah, and that's now because the propaganda with that king was real. They tried to say that he was descended from Cyrus the Great and Alexander the Great, which is like the two greatest kings ever. So it's like you kind of like, okay, that's probably bullshit. But and then so then you add that with the star. Now, if his name is if Mithridates is probably a Mithras, right? I mean, I'm just his name. I mean, I could be wrong. Maybe
He
Zoroastrian.
he would have been a Zoroastrian, and Mithra is part of Zoroastrian pantheon.
Yeah. So yeah, Mithra is a mediator in that religion. He's mentioned a few times in the Zenvesta and the Gathas. But so the reason why I bring that up is because the Magi are the priests of that religion. So there's a connection now between the Star of Bethlehem story, where there's Magi see the star, and so they're Magi, so they're obviously Zoroastrian, and then you got Mithridates, who's has sort of a similar story, also involving Magi. So it almost makes you wonder if this is like something that was important for kings back then.
It definitely was important to have a birth story that basically had some way or another the gods showing that they're showing favoritism. Whether it was at the birth of Plato, bees coming on his lips so that way his speech would be sweet, or the signs that were supposed to be at the birth of Julius Caesar Augustus. There were supposed to have been lightning striking statues and things that were supposed to be prophetic as well. Pretty much anybody who is anybody had to have some sort of story that said right at their birth they were just the best thing since sliced bread. And considering the ancients didn't have sliced bread, this would have been an amazing innovation for them.
Well, the reason why I bring that all up is because now you have to factor in that this whole thing could just be just written up, like just kind of made up. Maybe there is no star. Or maybe it's a combination of both. Maybe there was a star, but they're just like, that's just a normal star. Maybe it was just Jupiter and Venus and just a normal conjunction. But they just say, hey, wouldn't that be better if this was the star of the star? And so, like, the imagination starts flowing, and they start writing up these myths. They remember the story of Mithridates' birth, and just like every other myth that's written, you get ideas, you get influenced by other ideas from different places, and you put it together. I mean, that sort of makes sense.
Potentially, though, if I were Matthew and I'm trying to write some sort of story that's going to get people in the Roman Empire to join my religion, I probably don't want to copy from Mithridates, because Mithridates is probably like one of the most vile figures to the Romans, because he basically led a mini genocide against the Romans in Greek territories. He basically orchestrated this mass slaughter of Romans to, well, one, get them out of territory, and two, scare the bejesus out of them. Now, the Romans didn't get scared the bejesus out of, they sent more armies, which is what the Romans always do.
Yeah.
You knock them down once, they come back with twice as many soldiers.
And if I'm not mistaken, he actually planned on marching into Rome at some point if he ever could get there. I don't know. If he never, obviously, never.
In the propaganda that his court seemed to be producing, he tried visualizing himself as this great fire that was going to burn up the eagle of Rome and have it, come crashing to earth and just, wash the entire Roman Empire with fire. And in Zoroastrian belief, it's incorrect to call Zoroastrians fire worshippers, but fire is like one of the most sacred things in their religion.
Yeah.
And in their apocalyptic view of things, in the last days, that basically the whole world will be covered in molten metal. Now, to the good, virtuous Zoroastrians, molten metal will feel like warm milk. It'll be completely comfortable, but to everyone else, it's going to feel like molten metal, and you're going to just be absolutely incinerated in that coming. And that's the sort of imagery that Mithridates was promoting of what he's going to bring on to the Romans. And eventually, of course, the Romans said no to that. And in his last days, that basically he has to commit suicide or otherwise get arrested by the oncoming legions to his capital.
Yeah, that's how he met his end. And it's almost
so if I were Matthew trying to copy stories to say how great Jesus is, if I called him the next Mithridates, I'm pretty sure that would not fly well within a Roman context.
Yeah, you make a good point there. So then it's like, and then it just makes you wonder, Is this? I mean, is because there's the story of the star doesn't really happen in the Old Testament, I don't think, right? Just kind of happens in the New.
Yeah. When looking for analogs, the one that comes up the most because it is prominent in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It comes up later during the Bar Kokhba revolt, the star prophecy from Numbers 24:17, where it talks about in this prophecy the pagan prophet Balaam is getting visions from God. He's trying, originally he's trying to curse the Jews, but instead God is like, no, you're going to say this and you're going to bless my people.
Yep.
And in the last prophecy he gives, he says, I see it not now, but it's coming. A star will rise out of Jacob and a scepter out of Israel. The
Oh,
imagery is ultimately supposed to be about King David, but everyone's reinterpreting it in the Dead Sea community. You could even see them arguing that this is a prophecy not about one, but of two messiahs. The star is one, the scepter is another. Bar Kokhba, his name itself means son of the star, and he's also trying to embody that prophecy as well. He's saying, I am literally that star, and I'm here to be, the Messiah that kicks butt and takes names.
there we go. Now we're getting somewhere. So this is important for the Messiah story. That's why it's there. You just said it. If they're talking about the star signifying King David's birth, well, who is Jesus? Jesus is the next King David. He's the next Messiah. He's the next. I mean, he's the next everything. He's the next Moses. He's the next Adam. He's the next. But David was called Messiah in the Old Testament, and if it's a star signifying his birth, it's only natural that the Messiah would also have a star signifying his birth. So I think that makes sense then.
Mhm. It will be worth noting that there isn't a story of a star at David's birth. There isn't any source for that, but there is a Samaritan version of the birth of Moses, where there was a star at his birth.
Okay, so there you go. It's pretty. It's this is a common thing then for people to write up these stories
Yeah,
about.
at least it becomes so. I would say more likely than not, the Samaritan version is influenced by the Christian story because we can't date the Samaritan version. So that would just be my guess on the probabilities of it, just because we don't have an early, clear version of the story, like on like really ancient papyrus or something. But it does show these are the sorts of stories people were telling, and we know people were adapting the Moses story in the way he was born. Like Josephus, when he retells the story of Moses, he's already changed it in some important ways that looks more similar to what we see in Matthew.
Really, can you refresh the people's memory about that? What does he exactly say there?
So there's a few things. One, Moses' father gets visions or dreams from God about the importance of his son.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, in the original Exodus story, the Pharaoh is going to be executing a bunch of baby boys, not because of an oncoming leader, but just population control.
Right.
In the Josephine story, Pharaoh gets a word from his prophets that there's going to be a great leader being born among the Jews, and we need to kill all the baby boys to prevent this leader from, coming to power.
Interesting. So he does change it up right there. And
Yeah, and in ways that look exactly like what we see in the Matthean version. I don't know if Matthew was reading Josephus because I don't know when Matthew wrote, but it's pretty interesting coincidence to see that.
yeah, that's fascinating to point out because Josephus also doesn't say that innocent babies were slaughtered by Herod. He doesn't say that. That doesn't happen in Josephus, but it happens in Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
So Matthew, if he's getting it from, I don't know, like you said, who knows when Matthew was written? I don't. People say it was written before Josephus, but there are some people who contest that. I mean, I would say it's hard to tell, but like you said, it's
Yeah,
really weird coincidence that he does mention it in the same way that they talk about the Moses thing.
yeah. It's not enough to say there's a genetic connection, but it definitely shows what was in the air amongst Jews or Jewish Christians of that general time period.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah,
that's
and
all
of
you
course,
can.
it's also worth noting that it's very weird that Josephus would not have mentioned the slaughter story because he was already saying all the sorts of terrible things Herod was doing in literally his last days, including he was going to try to execute dozens and dozens of people the day he died just to make sure people would be crying when he dies. If he
Right.
was also going out killing babies to go after what he thinks is an usurper baby, you would think it's like, okay, this has to show his absolute madness. And according to Matthew, this wasn't just something only Herod knew about. because, again, according to the story, when the Magi show up, he says Herod was troubled and all of Jerusalem. In other words, it should have been noticed and recorded rather than just one throwaway line in a gospel of unknown origin of someone who's, trying to say our kid is the new Moses.
Yeah, and which kind of tells you where the because Josephus is trying to write an actual history. He's not really. I mean, that's not all accurate, obviously, but
Yeah.
I mean, he's talking about finding the boat that Noah was in and stuff like all this crazy stuff. But he is trying to tell. He's trying to tell the truth and trying to be historical. So when he leaves out the Herod, which Herod killing babies, and then you see that Matthew saying that Herod killed babies the same way that Pharaoh did it. You're right away. It tells you, it's like, okay, this is a retelling of the Pharaoh story.
Yeah, that at least should be the instant reaction from anyone with that sort of historical sensibility. If we were saying this sort of story about the birth of Muhammad, we would have instantly said, clearly they're trying to make Muhammad look like a new Moses, a new lawgiver. But because it's Jesus, then the Christian apologists have to say, no, there's got to be some reason Josephus didn't mention it. It just wasn't enough babies to worth mentioning. Herod was a bad guy anyway, so this fits what he would do. And of course, having the mindset to do it isn't the same thing as doing it. There's no way you can get a murder charge on someone saying, but we know deep down you're a bad person. We can't prove you killed this person, but we know you would like to. That's not how we would ever prosecute something in law, and I don't think we should apply that to history as well, especially when, again, you'd think people would notice, oh yeah, he's a literal baby killer. That gets people, even if it's only one baby or even going after one baby, you literally sent your soldiers into another town to commit infanticide. People notice these things.
Right. That's not something that just get no. And another thing about Matthew, since we're on the subject of Matthew is the only person who remembers zombies coming out of the ground at the time of Jesus' death. Like, no one remembers that. Also, John doesn't write about that. Luke doesn't write about that. Mark doesn't write about that. And no one else in the Roman Empire, no other historians ever wrote about it. There was a time where somebody got crucified and people came out of the ground and were walking around in Jerusalem. And Matthew
and we're seen by Benny.
Right. And Matthew just throws that in there. And it's like, if you're trying to get us to be convinced, you might want to tone it down a little bit with the.
Oh, no, he does the exact opposite as much as he can, because he's taking already the pretty magical death of Jesus from Mark, where there's already, darkness at noon for 3 hours, the temple veil being ripped. And then Matthew looks at that and says, hold my wine. I'm adding an earthquake and zombies.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fascinating though. It's definitely, I just love it. I don't know. I just love digging into this stuff. It's just a passion of mine. And I'm wondering now, when did the astrology world start to fade out? How long did it stay? Like, did the Roman Empire carry this into the Middle Ages and beyond that? Do you have a?
Well, I don't want to say astrology died out, because right now, according to the polling, people our age and our demographic are actually majority astrology believers.
That's a good point. It didn't die.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It has transformed, and maybe the better way to say is, when did it die out amongst like the intellectual elites? When did it basically fall out from
like
scientific practice?
Right.
Because I mentioned Kepler. In many ways, Kepler was one of the last great scientific astrologers. And even in his own time, he even said most of the stuff that the astrologers write, most of the stuff we've inherited, is garbage.
Right.
He literally called it like vile smelling dung. Like, that's almost a direct quote from his original German in translation.
Germans always have a funny way of describing things.
Yeah. So, but by the time you get to people like Newton, and he's already apparently he had an astrology textbook or book in his library, and we can look at the book and actually see he dog-eared a couple of the pages, but otherwise it didn't seem to interest him. One of the early royal astronomers, John Flamsteed, around the same time as Newton as well, when he was a young man, he was super into astrology, practiced it, but then as a late teenager, early 20-year-old, he picked up another book, and that person was going through all these horoscopes for these important people and saying how great they were. And he looked at the same horoscope and is like, if I didn't know the name this was attached to, these people should have been like paupers, or really terrible sort of things, and that led him like down to complete skepticism.
Interesting.
So basically, end of the 17th century, early 18th century, it's basically died amongst astronomers. It's separated off, and any astrologers left are basically kind of on the fringe in esoterica.
Seems like there's a correlation between when the Enlightenment happened and the end of the astrology within science age, I guess.
Yeah, and especially with like when Kepler was trying to understand astrology, he was also kind of at the cusp for understanding causation in a scientific sense. Once you get to the Newtonian world, you then have the mechanical clockwork universe,
Right.
and you see causes, in terms of forces and things like that. You have to then abandon the older ideas of causation through metaphor, through sympathetic magic.
Right.
Uh, like just to give comparison, if you were reading the old medical manual from Paracelsus from a couple centuries before Newton, he talks about like this special salve that if you wipe it across a murder weapon, you will see that it actually also affects the wound of the person who was injured by it.
Wow.
Weird things like that. But that sort of idea, that sympathetic magic, affect the murder weapon, affects the wound uh, at a distance, that sort of thinking basically begins to disappear and is, for all intents and purposes, gone by the beginning of the 18th century.
And you know what's ironic about all that is that Newton himself was a staunch believer in sort of the metaphysical, and he was writing about the Bible, and he had a prediction of the end times being 2040, I think it was, or 2030 maybe, or something like that.
Yeah, it's going to be in our time. I think the 2050, 60, I forget the exact year because, apocalypses are a dime a dozen. I can't keep track of all of them anymore.
So many, yeah.
But
But
yeah, he was a huge Bible nerd and an alchemist.
yes, alchemist, yeah, which is kind of like another thing like astrology, where it's like sort of based in science in a way, but it like has its own like the philosopher's stone and like things like that.
Yeah,
But like it's also has like transmuting of metals and mercury, and there's like some real stuff there. It's just
yeah,
the way they try to interpret it is just kind of meta. You know,
yeah. Again, he's kind of at the cusp of it because astrology, or I shouldn't say, alchemy, ultimately kind of becomes our chemistry once it, properly sciences up. And unlike astrology, there's a physical thing that you're making, and you can actually see, did the recipe actually work? Did it produce the expected outcome? Or you mix a couple chemicals together, and then you see these weird color changes, or this smoke being given off, or these weird formations happening when things crystallize. It's like you can see this almost magical transformation right in front of your eyes. Uh, Now, usually the alchemist will also include astrology, so you have to take into account the position of Jupiter or the phases of the moon or the time of night that you're doing the experiment, these sorts of things that are supposed to affect it by, again, means of sympathetic magic. Usually the planets were also associated with metals. Heck, the name Mercury getting associated with the actual element Mercury.
yeah.
That's the most direct one.
Do you,
Also
now,
called Quicksilver.
do you know? You might know this better than I do, and if you do, just take it over because I know there's a alchem there's an alchemy theme behind Mercury being like a logos, where like so the term logos by Philo, he defines it as the thing that the glue, basically the glue that holds the universe together. Basically, is
Hmm.
what the logos is. For Mercury, Mercury is symbolic for the god who's like the messenger of he's the mouthpiece of the god of Jupiter, but he also the metal Mercury can hold metals together, but also can put them up, bring them apart, and like extract metals or something like that. Now I don't have no idea what I'm saying right now, but there's a metaphor there with Mercury being that god, but also the metal does what the god does in a weird way. I don't know if you were familiar with that.
Yeah, that goes to more metallurgy stuff that I don't know very well, but it does, of course, make sense of all the important associations that Mercury has, because not only is he a messenger of the gods, but he's also in some ways important to the dying as well. That he's often also treated as a psychopomp. He leads souls to the afterlife.
Right.
So he's a busy god.
Yeah, he's very important. Yeah. He's
Yeah. And also like Mercury has some really weird properties. It's one of two metals, two elements, I should say, that's actually liquid at room temperature. That's a really strange, weird thing. And one of the reasons it's called quicksilver is that it has the color of silver, but it runs like a liquid. It's a kind of fun to play with, but on the other hand, if you play with it, it will drive you mad.
Yeah, and that's where the term Mad Hatter comes from, because the Hatters used to use mercury to shine their hats or whatever they were doing with it. I have no idea.
When they were catching beaver and had to remove the hard quills from beaver quills. So if you catch a beaver, not that I recommend that you do, but they have quills almost like a porcupine, and clearly don't want to put that on your head. But apparently, like, rubbing mercury helps rip off those quills. But you're now literally rubbing mercury, looking over. Do that for months and years.
So that's where the term Mad Hatter comes from. That's interesting.
Exactly.
And now I don't know why I thought about this, but there's another story about Galileo using the astrology language to please the Medicis, because the Medicis were the big funders of astrology. I mean, there's the church. You can go to the church. The church doesn't really care too much about that. But the Medicis, they have money and they want to know about the stars. So I don't know if you're familiar with this story, but I heard that Galileo found, when he found, I think it was Jupiter or something, there was like 3 dots, I guess, for the ring. Or no, Saturn, I think it was. Saturn the rings had 3 dots. It looked like 3 bodies of 3 different bodies. You know the story or no?
I think, you're actually recounting the story of the discovery of Jupiter's moons.
Okay, go ahead. You could tell that then.
So Galileo is observing Jupiter through his brand new telescope that he had crafted himself. He didn't invent the telescope, but he learned how to make them himself and try to improve the power a little bit, things like that. And he's one of the first to also then point it up in the night sky and make observations, write about it. Increase his fame by saying just how awesome of an observer he is. And so he's looking at Jupiter. And first off, interesting thing about his notes. So originally he's looking at Jupiter, he's taking notes, and he's writing everything in Italian.
Right.
Then he is looking and he's seeing, these little dots around Jupiter. And eventually he realizes, by looking at them from successive night to night, that they are moving and orbiting Jupiter. And once he realizes that, he switches from writing from Italian to Latin.
Why?
That's when he realized these things are orbiting Jupiter, and now he just made a scientific discovery, and now he has to science the shit out of this.
Oh.
So literally, we can actually tell by the hour when his thinking shifted and when he finally jumped from thinking maybe the Copernican system is right to he just realized things are not orbiting the Earth. I'm a Copernican now. We can see that shift in his thinking to the hour.
Wow. Now, I've heard this story, but it's connected to the Medicis, where he sees the 3 bodies.
He sees the 4 stars, and he originally calls them the Medici Stars.
And it's because
he names it after his patron, and that was actually fairly common. Another example of that as well with William Herschel, the person who discovered the planet we call Uranus. He didn't call it Uranus, though. He called it George. King George.
King George, right. That makes sense.
King George III, the George that the U.S. broke from. But that was his ultimate patron, and so he was trying to honor the King of England, and so he named it, King George's Star.
That makes sense. That's if someone's funding you to find things in the sky, you're going to obviously credit them for your findings. And so Galileo was called the Medicis based on how many brothers it was. Was that what it was?
I don't know if he had a good reason for associating with particular family members, but nonetheless, he was going to name it after his patrons because they were funding him and funding him handsomely. And they were doing that basically until the last minute when he was finally condemned by the Catholic Church.
Right. And that's interesting to see how that sort of political thing was happening between the church, the Medicis, and Galileo. It's fascinating. They should make a movie about that. But so you got this King George star. It's this new star that or planet, I should say. They find this new planet. When did it come back to how did it become a Greek god's name? Because that's the name of a Greek god of heaven, Uranus.
My basic understanding is that basically the rest of Europe is like, we're not calling this after an English king. And also just, look at the tradition we have. All the planets are named after Roman gods. Let's give it a nice Roman name.
Saturn, Jupiter, George.
Exactly. And later, of course, when Neptune was discovered, and was discovered by a French astronomer, if I remember correctly, and the English definitely weren't going to have it named after Louis or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it would be interesting if the final planets were named Huey, Dewey, and Louie, but that is not the history we have.
I think that's better for everybody, that we just keep it all Roman Greek gods and everyone's happy. But yeah, this has been a really interesting chat, and I'm definitely going to have you back on because you're very knowledgeable. And where can people find some of your work?
So, in theory, I have a blog, but I am so lackadaisical with ever posting anything there. It's not the best, but I do have a website, draaronadair.com, which has various bits of contact info, stuff why people should pay attention to me, and why, in theory, I know what I'm talking about, or at least I have grandiose claims for why I think I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, of course.
So, yeah, my publications, other contact things, that's probably the best place to go to.
Awesome. I'll put that's all in the description, and that's also going to be in the comments too. So you can click on whichever one, and you'll get there. And everyone who's watching, you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.
Jesus.